Imagine for a moment standing in front of your open closet. Your eyes sweep across rows of perfectly manufactured textiles. You see cotton t-shirts woven from plants grown on another continent, wool sweaters sheared from selectively bred sheep, synthetic athletic wear forged in chemical laboratories, and waterproof jackets engineered to withstand monsoons. You reach out, grab a shirt, pull it over your head, and walk out the door without giving it a single second thought. It is the most mundane, ordinary action in our modern daily routine. But what you have just done is participate in a prehistoric tradition, a profound evolutionary rebellion that fundamentally separated our species from every other living creature on the face of the earth. You have armored yourself against nature. You have chosen an artificial skin. But how did this happen? How did we go from being wandering naked apes foraging in the sun-baked savannas of East Africa to the impeccably dressed, fashion-conscious global species we are today? The story of the very first clothes is not just a story about staying warm. It is a thrilling, dangerous, and brilliantly innovative saga of survival, technological revolution, and the birth of human identity. It is the story of how our ancestors literally wrapped themselves in the skin of their prey to conquer the globe. By the way, before we travel back hundreds of thousands of years into the freezing winds of the Ice Age, I have a quick question for you. What is the oldest piece of clothing you currently have in your wardrobe? Is it a lucky t-shirt from high school? A vintage leather jacket from the 90s? Or maybe a heavy winter coat passed down from your grandparents? Drop a comment down below right now. Let's see who among us holds the title for the most ancient modern fashion. To truly understand the origin of clothing, we first have to understand the origin of our own nakedness. If you look at our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the orangutans, they are all covered in thick protective fur. For millions of years, the ancestors of the human lineage were identically insulated. Fur is incredibly practical. It keeps the blazing sun off the skin, it holds a layer of warm air against the body during the cold nights, it provides a physical buffer against scratches, thorns, and biting insects. It is nature's perfect, maintenance-free garment. So why did we lose it? The answer lies in the dramatic climate shifts that transformed the African landscape around 2 to 3 million years ago. As dense, lush rainforests began to dry out and recede, they were replaced by vast, open, grassy savannas. Our ancestors, the early hominins, were forced out of the shaded canopy of the trees and into the relentless, baking heat of the open plains. In this new environment, survival meant moving. It meant walking long distances to find food and water. Eventually, it meant hunting, not by sprinting like a cheetah, but by relentlessly tracking and pursuing prey over miles and miles of open ground under the blazing equatorial sun. This hunting strategy, known as persistence hunting, required an incredible level of endurance. But there was a massive biological hurdle: overheating. An animal covered in thick fur cannot run for hours in the midday African sun without its brain practically boiling in its skull. Our ancestors needed a cooling system, and evolution provided a masterpiece of biological engineering. We lost our thick fur and develop millions of eccrine sweat glands across our entire bodies. We became the sweatiest mammals on the planet. As the sweat evaporated from our bare skin, it cooled our blood, allowing early humans to run for hours on end, exhausting their furry, overheating prey. We traded our natural coats for the ability to become the ultimate endurance predators. For a long time, being a naked, sweating ape was a tremendous advantage. In the warm cradle of Africa, we didn't need clothing. The nights might have been slightly chilly, but huddled together around the newly discovered miracle of fire, early humans were perfectly comfortable. However, humanity has never been characterized by a willingness to stay in one place. We are explorers by our very nature. As populations grew and food sources fluctuated, bands of early humans began to push the boundaries of their territory. They moved north, venturing out of the familiar, warm embrace of the African continent and stepping into the unknown landscapes of Eurasia. And it was here that our greatest biological advantage, our naked, sweat-cooled skin, suddenly became our greatest, deadliest vulnerability. Imagine the shock of those first migrations. As our ancestors pushed into the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, the climate began to change. The welcoming heat of the savanna was replaced by biting winds, freezing rain, and plunging nighttime temperatures. And then there was the Ice Age. The Pleistocene epoch was a time of violent, unpredictable climate swings, featuring massive glaciations where thick sheets of ice crept down from the poles, locking the northern hemisphere in a bitter, unrelenting deep freeze. For a naked ape, this environment was an immediate death sentence. Frostbite would claim fingers and toes within hours. Hypothermia would shut down internal organs overnight. Our ancestors were entirely unequipped for this new world. They could not grow their fur back. Evolution works far too slowly for that. They were faced with a brutal binary choice: adapt immediately or go extinct. It was in this desperate, freezing crucible of survival that a profound psychological leap occurred. We don't know the name of the genius who first had the thought, nor do we know exactly when or where it happened. But at some point, a freezing human looked at the bloody, freshly killed carcass of a deer or a bear and realized something revolutionary. That animal survived the cold because of its fur. If I take its fur, I can survive the cold too. It sounds incredibly obvious to us today, but conceptually, this was an earth-shattering paradigm shift. It was the moment humans stopped relying entirely on their own biology and began to appropriate the biological advantages of other species. Clothing became our first external organ. We outsourced our thermoregulation to the animals we hunted. The very first clothes were nothing like the tailored, fitted garments we know today. They were incredibly crude, chaotic, and unimaginably uncomfortable. Picture a raw, unprocessed animal hide. When an animal is first skinned, the hide is heavy, wet, and covered in fat, muscle tissue, and blood on the inside. If you simply drape a raw hide over your shoulders, it will keep you warm for a short time, but within days it will begin to putrefy. It will rot, it will attract swarms of flies, the stench will become unbearable, and eventually it will dry out into a stiff, rock-hard board that cracks when you try to bend it. A raw, dried hide is utterly useless as a piece of clothing. It is more like wearing a piece of rigid wooden armor. To turn an animal skin into something that could actually be worn day after day, early humans had to invent an entirely new industrial process. They had to invent leatherworking. This is where the archaeological record begins to give us some fascinating clues. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, alongside the early humans and our famous cousins, the Neanderthals, we start seeing the appearance of specific, specialized stone tools known as scrapers. These weren't the sharp, pointed spears used for hunting, nor the heavy hand axes used for chopping bone. Scrapers had a flat, carefully chipped, duller edge. Their sole purpose was to forcefully scrape the rotting fat and connective tissue off the inside of an animal hide without accidentally slicing through the skin itself. Imagine the sheer physical labor involved in this prehistoric laundry day. A hunter-gatherer would have to peg a massive, bloody bear hide to the freezing ground, kneel beside it, and spend hours, perhaps days, painstakingly scraping every square inch of the skin until it was completely clean. But even scraping wasn't enough. A clean hide that dries out will still become stiff. To make it supple, to make it drape over the human body like fabric, it had to be tanned and softened. How did they do this without modern chemicals? They used what they had. They would rub the animal's own brains into the hide, a process still known today as brain tanning, as the emulsified fats in brain tissue are excellent for breaking down the stiff fibers of the skin. They would chew the leather with their own teeth, breaking down the tough collagen hour after agonizing hour, wearing their enamel down to the dentin just to have a soft cloak to wear through the winter. They would smoke the hides over smoldering fires, a brilliant chemical discovery where the formaldehyde in the wood smoke bonded with the proteins in the skin, preventing it from rotting when it got wet. These early garments were almost certainly simple capes or ponchos. A massive mammoth or bear pelt would be draped over the shoulders and perhaps tied at the chest with a strip of raw leather or pinned together with a sharp piece of bone. For a long time, this was the pinnacle of human fashion, and for the Neanderthals, who were biologically much better adapted to the cold, with their stocky, heat-retaining bodies, these simple draped capes might have been entirely sufficient to survive the European winters. They lived like this for hundreds of thousands of years, the ultimate masters of the Ice Age landscape, wrapped in heavy, smoky, brain-tanned furs. But as the timeline marched forward, an invisible clock was ticking. A new wave of Homo sapiens was preparing to leave Africa. These were our direct ancestors, and they were anatomically modern humans. They were tall, lanky, and lightly built, perfect for dissipating heat on the African savanna, but absolutely terrible for retaining heat in the glacial tundras of the north. When these modern humans finally arrived in Eurasia, encountering the deep freeze of the late Pleistocene, a simple draped cape thrown over the shoulders was no longer enough. The freezing winds would whip underneath the loose hides, stealing their precious body heat. Frostbite would creep up their exposed arms and legs. To survive where the Neanderthals thrived, modern humans couldn't just drape clothing. They had to invent something much more complex. They had to enclose the body completely. They needed sleeves. They needed pants. They needed fitted, tailored clothing. But here is a fascinating problem for archaeologists. How do we know when humans started wearing complex clothes? Clothes are made of organic materials, animal skins, plant fibers, furs. Unlike stone tools or fossilized bones, clothing rots away into nothingness. Put a leather jacket in the dirt, and in a few thousand years, there won't be a single trace of it left. For decades, scientists struggled to pinpoint exactly when humanity made the leap from wearing simple, draped hides to wearing tailored, fitted garments. We couldn't look for the clothes themselves because they were gone. So, modern science had to look for something else. Something truly bizarre. To find the origin of tailored clothing, scientists didn't look at stones, and they didn't look at bones. They looked at lice. Yes, lice, those microscopic, blood-sucking parasites that have plagued humanity for our entire existence. Human beings are entirely unique in the primate world because we are the only primate that hosts two completely different types of lice on our bodies, the head louse and the body louse. The head louse lives, as you might guess, in the hair on our heads. It is an ancient parasite that has been with us since before we even became human. But the body louse is completely different. The body louse cannot survive in hair. Its claws are specifically evolved to grab onto fibers, the fibers of clothing. The body louse lives in the seams of our garments, completely dependent on our clothes for its survival, only dropping down onto our skin for a quick blood meal before retreating back into the fabric. This gave geneticists a brilliant idea. If the body louse can only survive in clothing, then the body louse could not possibly exist before clothing was invented. By taking the DNA of the head louse and the DNA of the body louse and calculating the rate of genetic mutation to find out exactly when the two species split from a common ancestor, scientists were able to create a biological clock for the invention of clothes. The results were astounding. The genetic divergence showed that the body louse evolved around 170,000 years ago. This number perfectly aligns with the end of the second-to-last major ice age. This means that at least 170,000 years ago, human beings were not just draping loose skins over their shoulders, they were wearing garments complex enough, tightly fitted enough, and worn consistently enough to create an entirely new ecological niche for a parasite to evolve. The revelation of the body louse provides a staggering timeline, placing the birth of complex clothing far deeper in our history than anyone previously imagined. But knowing when they wore these clothes still leaves us with a colossal mechanical mystery. How did they make them? Creating a fitted, windproof garment is an incredibly complex engineering challenge. You cannot simply wrap a hide around your leg and expect it to stay there while you are sprinting across a glacier chasing a woolly rhino. You need to shape the material to the contours of the human body, and, most importantly, you need to firmly attach the pieces together. For tens of thousands of years, the primary method for joining leather was lacing. Early humans would use a sharp, pointed stone or bone tool called an awl to violently punch a series of holes along the edges of two pieces of animal skin. Then they would take a thin strip of leather, a thong, and manually push it through the holes, lashing the two pieces together. If you've ever laced up a pair of heavy winter boots, you understand the basic principle. Lacing is strong, and it is relatively easy to do. It was likely the exact method used to create the very first crude footwear, protecting early feet from jagged ice and freezing mud. But lacing has a fatal flaw when it comes to extreme cold. Every time you punch a hole with an awl, you are removing material. You are creating a gap. And when you pull a leather lace through that gap, it never seals perfectly tight. In the relatively mild climates of southern Europe or the Middle East, a laced tunic might be perfectly fine. But step out onto the unforgiving, wind-blasted steppes of Pleistocene Siberia, where the temperature can plunge to 40 degrees below zero, and those tiny gaps become a matter of life and death. The freezing wind will find every single hole. It will slice through the laced seams like invisible icy knives, stripping away the body's trapped heat in seconds. Laced clothing simply cannot provide a truly airtight, windproof seal. To conquer the deep freeze of the Ice Age, humanity needed a technological miracle. We needed a tool capable of creating microscopic holes and pulling a razor-thin filament through them, pulling the leather edges so tightly together that they virtually fused into one solid piece. We needed the invention of the eyed needle. It is easy to look at a needle today, a cheap, tiny sliver of stamped steel you can buy by the hundreds at a dollar store, and dismiss it as an insignificant household object. But make no mistake, the eyed needle is one of the most brilliant, transformative, and vital technological inventions in the entire history of our species. It ranks right alongside the mastery of fire, the invention of the wheel, and the splitting of the atom. The needle allowed humans to manufacture portable, highly efficient microclimates. It allowed us to survive in environments that were completely, fundamentally hostile to our biology. The oldest known needle in the world was discovered in the famous Zuzuan Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, dating back an astonishing 50,000 years. It was not made of metal. Metallurgy was still tens of thousands of years in the future. It was painstakingly carved from the bone of a large, unidentified bird. Imagine, just for a second, the unbelievable level of craftsmanship, patience, and manual dexterity required to make a tiny, delicate needle using nothing but stone tools. First, an ancient artisan had to select the perfect piece of dense, hard bone or mammoth ivory. They had to use a sharp flint blade to carve a long, thin splinter. Then, using a piece of rough sandstone as prehistoric sandpaper, they would grind and polish the bone splinter for hours, slowly shaping it into a perfectly smooth, tapered cylinder with a lethally sharp point. But the hardest part was yet to come. They had to create the eye. Using a microscopic, sharply pointed fragment of quartz or flint, the artisan had to meticulously drill a hole through the top of the bone splinter, a hole sometimes no wider than a single millimeter. One wrong move, 1 ounce of extra pressure, and the fragile bone would snap, destroying hours of agonizing labor. But when they succeeded, they possessed a tool of unparalleled power. and with the needle came the necessary invention of thread. You can't fit a bulky leather lace through a 1 millimeter hole. Early humans had to look to the anatomy of their prey once again. They discovered that the long, tough tendons running down the legs or along the spine of animals like deer and reindeer possessed incredible tensile strength. By taking a dried tendon and pounding it with a smooth stone, they could break it down into thin individual fibers. These fibers, known as sinew, could then be moistened with saliva and rolled against the thigh, twisting them together to create a smooth, incredibly strong thread that wouldn't rot easily and could slide effortlessly through the eye of a bone needle. With the needle and sinew thread in hand, human clothing underwent a spectacular revolution. We stopped draping and we started tailoring. Modern humans began to carefully measure and cut animal hides into complex geometric shapes. They created tight-fitting pants that hugged the legs, trapping a layer of warm air directly against the skin. They crafted heavy hooded parkas from thick furs like wolf and wolverine, because wolf fur has a unique property. Frost from human breath won't easily freeze and stick to it, keeping the face protected. They invented mittens, which keep fingers warmer than gloves by allowing them to share radiant heat. And they invented layered clothing systems, perhaps a soft, thin layer of rabbit fur worn against the skin, covered by a heavy, wind-proof shell of reindeer hide on the outside. This tailored, layered, wind-proof clothing was the ultimate survival suit. It is widely believed by many anthropologists that this exact technological advantage is one of the main reasons why anatomically modern humans survived the Ice Age, while the robust, powerful Neanderthals slowly faded into extinction. Neanderthals were incredibly strong and possessed massive brains. But the archaeological record shows very little evidence that they ever adopted the eyed needle. They relied on their physical adaptations and simpler draped capes. This restricted them to the relatively sheltered, forested valleys of Europe. Modern humans, wearing their tightly sewn thermal survival suits, could march confidently out onto the barren, wind-scoured tundras, exploiting entirely new hunting grounds and outcompeting their cousins. Our ancestors quite literally sowed their way to global dominance. But a fascinating psychological shift happens when a species is no longer struggling purely to survive. Once the incredibly complex problem of staying warm was definitively solved by tailored clothing, clothes stopped being just about utility. They stopped being purely functional armor against the cold. The human brain, wired for social connection, symbolism, and art, looked at these blank leather canvases covering our bodies and realized they could be used to communicate. Clothing became the first mass medium. It became a way to broadcast exactly who you were, what you owned, and where you stood in the tribe without having to speak a single word. This brings us to one of the most breathtaking and significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century: the burials at Sungir, located about 120 miles east of modern-day Moscow. Uncovered in the 1950s and dating back approximately 32,000 to 34,000 years, the Sungir site provides a stunning, crystal-clear window into the dawn of high fashion, social hierarchy, and profound human vanity. When archaeologists excavated the graves at Sungir, they didn't just find bones. They found the ghosts of incredibly elaborate garments. The leather and fur had rotted away over 30 millennia, but the decorations attached to them had not. In one grave lay the skeleton of an adult man, likely between 40 and 50 years old, a very respectable age for the Paleolithic era. Arranged precisely around his bones, exactly where they would have been sewn onto his clothing, were more than 3,000 painstakingly carved, perfectly polished mammoth ivory beads. Let that number sink in. 3,000 beads. This wasn't just a handful of lucky charms thrown into a grave. These beads were arranged in intricate horizontal rows across his chest, down his arms, and along his legs, outlining what was clearly a tightly fitted pair of pants and a tunic. He wore a headband adorned with pierced fox teeth, heavy ivory bracelets on his arms, and an ivory pendant around his neck. In a neighboring grave, the findings were even more spectacular. Buried head to head were two young children, a boy roughly 13 years old and a girl about 10. The children were buried with a staggering 10,000 mammoth ivory beads sewn onto their garments, along with massive, heavy spears carved from completely straightened mammoth tusks, an engineering marvel in its own right. To understand the sheer magnitude of what these clothes represent, we have to talk about labor. Experimental archaeologists, scientists who recreate ancient tools and techniques to understand the past, have attempted to replicate the Sungir mammoth ivory beads. They found that carving, drilling, and polishing just one single bead using Ice Age stone tools takes roughly 45 minutes of intense, unbroken labor. If we do the math, the 13,000 beads found on the man and the two children represent nearly 10,000 hours of highly skilled, painstaking craftsmanship. 10,000 hours. In a brutal, unforgiving Ice Age environment where finding enough calories to survive was a daily struggle, a group of humans dedicated 10,000 hours of their time, years of cumulative labor, not to hunting, not to building shelters, not to gathering firewood, but to making decorative beads for their clothes. Why? Because the clothing of Sungir tells a complex, profoundly modern story. These heavily beaded garments were far too heavy and delicate to be worn during a muddy, bloody mammoth hunt. They were ceremonial. They were the Ice Age equivalent of a bespoke haute couture tuxedo or a royal coronation gown. The man buried with the 3,000 beads was not just an ordinary hunter. He was someone of immense social importance. His clothes loudly broadcast his wealth, his status, and the respect he commanded from his community. And the children? A 10-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy could not possibly have achieved the legendary hunting status or political wisdom required to quote 10,000 hours of communal labor. Their unimaginable wealth was inherited. The clothing of the Sungir children is the earliest concrete evidence we have in human history of an established social hierarchy, of a stratified society where status is passed down through bloodlines. The beads sewn onto their tiny, tailored jackets and pants shouted to the entire Ice Age world, "We are elite. We are important. Look upon our wealth." Fashion, as a concept, had fully arrived. We had transitioned from wearing clothes to survive the world to wearing clothes to define our place within it. But this explosion of fashion wasn't just limited to heavy furs, leather, and heavy ivory beads. While the northern hunters were mastering the art of the tailored leather suit, humans living in slightly milder climates were looking past the animal kingdom for their wardrobe. They were looking at the plants beneath their feet. And in a remote cave in the Caucasus Mountains, archaeologists discovered a microscopic clue that changed everything we thought we knew about the colorful, vibrant reality of the ancient world. The cave is called Zuzuan, nestled deep within the rugged foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in the modern-day Republic of Georgia. When a team of international archaeologists and paleoanthropologists began carefully excavating its dark, damp floors in the late 2000s, they weren't looking for ancient fashion. They were looking for pollen spores to understand the ancient climate, analyzing microscopic dust particles trapped in layers of clay that had lain undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. But as they looked through their high-powered microscopes at samples dating back a staggering 34,000 years, they didn't just see pollen. They saw something completely out of place. They saw tiny, microscopic fibers. These weren't animal hairs or the tough, natural roots of cave plants. These fibers had a distinctive, twisted structure. They had been deliberately manipulated. The scientists had discovered the oldest known spun thread in human history, made from wild flax. But the most mind-blowing part of the Zuzuan Cave discovery wasn't just the fact that these ancient humans were spinning plant fibers into thread. It was what they were doing with that thread. Under the microscope, the fibers glowed with vivid, unnatural colors. The scientists found flax fibers that had been dyed a brilliant turquoise blue, a soft pink, and a deep, stark black. This completely shatters our stereotypical Hollywood image of the grim, filthy caveman wrapped exclusively in dirty brown, mud-stained furs. 34,000 years ago, humans were deliberately walking out into the wilderness, harvesting wild flax plants and extracting natural pigments from roots, crushed insects, and minerals. They were boiling these pigments over campfires and carefully dyeing their handmade threads to create brightly colored garments. Why? Because humans have an innate, undeniable psychological need for aesthetic beauty and personal expression. Even in the depths of the Ice Age, surrounded by cave lions and towering mammoths, we wanted to look good. We wanted to wear pink and turquoise. We wanted our clothing to be a canvas for our creativity. But the process of turning a wild flax plant into a beautifully dyed turquoise string is a technological nightmare. It is a grueling, multi-step industrial process that requires an intimate, scientific understanding of plant biology. You cannot simply pull a flax plant out of the ground and tie it around your waist. The usable fibers of the flax plant are locked deep inside the woody stalk of the stem. To get them out, ancient humans had to invent a process called retting. They would harvest the tall, thin flax stalks and submerge them in stagnant pools of water, or lay them out in the morning dew for weeks. They literally had to let the outer bark of the plant rot away, relying on natural bacteria to eat the woody stems while leaving the tough inner cellulose fibers intact. Once the plant had rotted just enough, but not too much, or the fibers would be destroyed, the stalks were dried and beaten with heavy wooden mallets to crush the remaining bark. Then the fibers were scraped and combed out. Only then, after weeks of rotting, drying and beating, were you left with a handful of rough, pale fibers. But these raw fibers are still too short and weak to be useful on their own. they had to be spun. Taking a few fibers in their fingers, these ancient textile workers would twist them together, continuously pulling and adding new fibers, locking the microscopic barbs of the plant cells together through tension and friction to create a continuous, unbroken string. It is almost impossible to overstate the importance of this invention. While the era is famously known as the Stone Age, many modern archaeologists and historians argue that it should really be called the String Age. The invention of spun string and cordage, what scholars call the String Revolution, was a massive, exponential leap forward for humanity, arguably just as important as the chipping of stone tools. String is the great unseen hero of human progress. With strong, spun cordage, you can tie a sharp piece of flint to a wooden shaft to make a reliable spear. You can weave large nets to safely trap dozens of fast-moving rabbits, or catch massive schools of fish, securing a massive caloric surplus. You can fashion snares, build complex shelters, and create slings to safely carry infants on your chest, leaving the mother's hands entirely free to forage. String allowed us to conquer our environment in ways that solid stone and wood never could. And of course, string allowed us to create a completely new kind of clothing. While the northern hunters relied on heavy, tailored animal skins to block the freezing winds, humans in milder climates began wearing woven plant fibers. Because textiles rot away so quickly in the archaeological record, we have very few physical scraps of this early clothing. But early humans left us clues in another medium: art. Across Europe, from the Pyrenees mountains of France to the frozen plains of Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of small, beautifully carved statues known as Venus figurines. These statues, carved from stone, bone, or ivory, depict female figures, usually with exaggerated breasts and hips, likely serving as symbols of fertility, motherhood, or female spiritual power. For a long time, historians assumed these figures were completely nude. But when textile experts began examining these statues under magnifying glasses, they noticed something incredible. The artists of the Paleolithic era had meticulously carved intricate details into the stone that went completely ignored by early male archaeologists. Take, for example, the famous Venus of Willendorf, a 30,000-year-old limestone figurine discovered in Austria. For decades, the complex textured pattern on her head was assumed to be highly stylized curly hair. But a closer inspection by textile historians revealed that the pattern is a continuous, spiraling, expertly woven basketry hat or a tightly coiled textile headdress. The carving is so precise that you can actually identify the exact method of weaving that the ancient artist was looking at. An even more striking example is the Venus of Lespugue, a 25,000-year-old ivory figurine found in France. Carved perfectly into the ivory, hanging low on her hips below her buttocks, is a skirt. But it is not a leather skirt. It is a finely detailed, meticulously carved __quote _3 __. You can clearly see a horizontal woven band resting on the hips, with dozens of individual twisted cords hanging down perfectly straight. A string skirt, consisting of loose hanging cords, provides absolutely zero warmth. It offers no protection from the wind or the rain. Its purpose is entirely symbolic. In many ancient cultures, right up through the historical periods of ancient Greece and Eastern Europe, the string skirt was a powerful symbol of womanhood, sexual maturity, and fertility. The movement of the dangling strings drew the eye, creating a kinetic visual display. It was, in essence, the world's very first lingerie, or perhaps a highly respected ceremonial garment marking a young woman's transition into adulthood. As the savage cold of the Pleistocene epoch finally began to break around 12,000 years ago, the great ice sheets retreated. The climate warmed, stabilizing into the Holocene epoch we live in today. And with this warmer, predictable climate came the single greatest paradigm shift in the history of our species, the agricultural revolution. Human beings slowly stopped their endless nomadic wandering. They put down their hunting spears, settled along the fertile banks of rivers in the Middle East, Asia, and the Americas, and began to tame the earth. They domesticated wheat, barley, and rice. They built permanent villages, which grew into towns, which eventually grew into the first roaring cities. And as our relationship with the land fundamentally changed, our relationship with clothing underwent a massive, permanent transformation. During the nomadic hunter-gatherer days, everything you owned had to be carried on your back. Clothing was highly prized and painstakingly made, but a nomadic lifestyle strictly limits how much stuff you can accumulate. Once we built permanent mud brick houses and secure storehouses, we could begin to hoard. We could begin to stockpile. For the first time, humanity could mass-produce textiles. The fields surrounding these early Neolithic settlements weren't just filled with edible crops. Vast tracts of land were dedicated exclusively to fashion. Entire economies began to be built on the back of the textile industry. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the cultivation of flax for making linen became an absolute obsession. The ancient Egyptians, living in the sweltering heat of the Nile River Valley, despised heavy animal skins. To them, wearing the fur of a dead animal was considered ritually unclean, something fit only for barbarians living out in the wild deserts. The Egyptians craved the cool, breathable, lightweight touch of linen. Linen became the absolute cornerstone of Egyptian society. It was not just clothing, it was currency, it was religion, and it was a direct measure of your soul's worth. The priests of the great temples of Karnak and Luxor were legally mandated to wear only pure, blindingly white linen, as it symbolized absolute purity. When the pharaohs and the wealthy nobility died, their bodies were not just buried. They were meticulously wrapped in hundreds of yards of the finest, most delicately woven linen to protect them for all of eternity. We have found Egyptian mummies wrapped in linen fabrics so exquisitely fine, so incredibly thin and sheer, that modern industrial machines struggle to replicate the quality today. They called this gossamer, almost transparent fabric, quote, for, and it was a luxury reserved strictly for the gods and kings. But while the Egyptians were mastering the cool touch of plant-based linen, the inhabitants of the cooler, more rugged terrains of Mesopotamia and the Levant were busy conquering a completely different kind of fiber. They were looking at the animals they had fenced into their newly built pens. They were looking at sheep. Today, when we think of a sheep, we picture a fluffy, rolling cloud of white wool that looks like a walking cotton ball. But the wild ancestor of the domestic sheep, an animal called the mouflon, which early humans first started herding around 10,000 years ago, did not look like that at all. The wild mouflon did not have a thick fleece of wool. It was covered in coarse, stiff, bristly hair, much like a deer or a dog, with only a very thin, short layer of soft, downy undercoat to keep it warm in the winter. If you tried to shear a wild mouflon, you would get a pile of stiff, scratchy, unusable hair. The story of wool is a story of incredible, patient genetic engineering. Early herders quickly realized that soft, downy winter undercoat of the wild sheep was incredibly warm, naturally water-resistant, and, crucially, it held dye beautifully. But there was very little of it. So, generation after generation, for thousands of years, these ancient shepherds engaged in selective breeding. Whenever a mutant lamb was born with a slightly thicker undercoat and slightly less coarse outer hair, they protected it, bred it, and multiplied it. Over millennia, human beings literally reshaped the biology of the sheep. We systematically bred away the harsh, stiff outer hair entirely and forced the soft, downy undercoat to grow continuously, year-round, into massive, heavy fleeces. We created an animal that produces so much wool that if a modern sheep is not sheared by a human, its fleece will grow so heavy it will eventually be immobilized and die. We made the sheep completely dependent on us, turning them into living, breathing textile factories. But before the invention of heavy iron shears, getting that wool off the sheep was a brutal, labor-intensive chore. You couldn't just buzz it off like a modern farmer. In the early Bronze Age, during the spring molting season, when the sheep naturally shed some of their winter coats, shepherds would have to chase down the animals, hold them tightly, and physically pluck the wool right out of the sheep's skin by hand. It was an exhausting, filthy job. Raw wool is completely saturated with a thick, greasy, pungent natural wax called lanolin. The plucker's hands would be coated in this sticky, foul-smelling grease, mixed with the dirt, feces, and sweat of the animal. Before this raw wool could be spun into fine yarn, it had to be violently scoured and washed in massive vats of hot water and natural alkalis, often using stale human urine for its ammonia content to cut through the grease. The stench of an ancient wool processing district would have been absolutely eye-watering, a pungent cloud of wet sheep and boiling ammonia hovering over the city. Once the massive quantities of flax and wool were cleaned and spun into endless miles of thread, humanity faced its next great engineering bottleneck. How do you turn thousands of individual strings into a solid, durable piece of fabric without spending months braiding them together by hand? The answer was a machine that fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. A machine whose basic operating principles are still used in every single textile factory on the planet today. They invented the loom. The loom is, quite literally, the very first digital computer in human history. It operates on a strict binary system, over or under, 1 or 0. At its core, weaving is the simple act of taking a stationary set of vertical threads, called the warp, and passing a moving horizontal thread, called the weft, alternately over and under the vertical strings to lock them together into a solid grid. Doing this by hand on a tabletop is agonizingly slow. The loom mechanized the process. Imagine walking into a dimly lit, smoky Neolithic house in ancient Greece or Scandinavia. Leaning against the wall, stretching all the way to the low ceiling, is a massive, heavy wooden frame. This is the warp-weighted loom. Hanging vertically from the top wooden beam are hundreds of individual spun threads. But they aren't just hanging loose. Tied to the bottom of every single thread is a heavy weight, usually a lump of fired clay or a carved stone with a hole punched through it. These weights pull the vertical warp threads incredibly taut, keeping them perfectly organized and under strict tension. The true genius of the loom lies in the heddle rod. Instead of the weaver having to painstakingly thread the horizontal yarn over and under every single vertical string with their fingers, the heddle rod allowed the weaver to physically pull half of the vertical strings forward all at once. This created a massive triangular gap between the front threads and the back threads, a space known as the quote, 5 __. The weaver could then take a wooden shuttle loaded with the horizontal thread and effortlessly throw it completely through the gap in a single fluid motion. Then they would drop the heddle rod, pick up the other half of the strings, and throw the shuttle back. Over and under, 1 and 0. Clack, clack, clack. The rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the loom weights knocking together and the heavy wooden batten slamming the threads tightly into place became the heartbeat of the ancient world. Weaving on these massive looms was incredibly physically demanding. It required standing for 10 to 12 hours a day, throwing the heavy wooden shuttle back and forth and violently beating the fabric upwards against gravity to ensure a tight, windproof weave. Because the looms were so large and the work so monotonous, weaving became an intensely social, communal activity. In many ancient cultures, the loom was strictly the domain of women. Mothers, daughters, and sisters would gather around the great wooden frames, singing rhythmic work songs to keep the pace of the shuttle moving, trading stories, and passing down oral histories while their hands blindly operated the complex binary code of the textiles. A single high-quality woolen tunic worn by a Greek hoplite soldier or a Celtic chieftain could easily represent hundreds of hours of combined labor, tending the sheep, plucking the raw wool, scouring it in urine, carding it, dyeing it with crushed madder roots or yellow weld flowers, spinning miles of yarn on a simple drop spindle, and finally weeks of standing at the great wooden frame, weaving it inch by inch. Clothing was no longer just a necessity for survival. It was an incredibly valuable store of accumulated labor. A beautifully woven, dyed cloak was as valuable as a sword or a small herd of cattle. It was a tangible, physical manifestation of a family's wealth and a society's technological mastery. But as human populations exploded and these agricultural villages swelled into the first megacities of the Bronze Age, the simple social hierarchies of the Ice Age, where the best hunter got the most ivory beads, became wildly complicated. Society was fracturing into rigid, strictly enforced classes. There were kings and slaves, priests and peasants, wealthy merchants and destitute laborers. And the ruling elite realized that clothing, this massive industry that consumed so much time and resources, was the ultimate tool for asserting absolute, unquestionable dominance over the masses. Fashion was about to be weaponized. As human societies swelled into massive, organized empires, the ruling elite recognized a fundamental psychological truth. If you can control what a person wears, you can control how they are perceived, and ultimately, you can control them. This realization birthed one of the most oppressive and fascinating legal concepts in human history: sumptuary laws. These were strict, legally binding regulations dictating exactly who was allowed to wear what, explicitly designed to prevent the lower classes from visually impersonating their social superiors. Fashion was no longer just a matter of wealth. It became a matter of law, order, and life or death. Nowhere in the ancient world was the weaponization of clothing more apparent or more highly regulated than in the beating heart of the Roman Empire. To the Romans, clothing was the ultimate ideological billboard, and the undisputed king of the Roman wardrobe was the toga. Today, thanks to college fraternity parties, we tend to think of a toga as a loose, comfortable bedsheet thrown casually over the shoulder. The historical reality of the Roman toga was entirely different. It was an absolute nightmare of a garment. A proper, high-status toga was a massive, semicircular piece of densely woven, unbleached wool that could be up to 18 feet long and incredibly heavy. Furthermore, you were not allowed to use buttons, pins, or belts to hold it together. The toga was held in place entirely by the precise, complex folding of the fabric and the constant, conscious tension of the wearer's left arm. To wear a toga was to declare to the world quote _6__. You literally could not do manual work in a toga. Your left arm was entirely occupied with holding the heavy wool in place, and if you moved too quickly, the entire garment would violently unravel. Putting on a toga was such a complex, agonizingly slow process that wealthy Roman senators required a specially trained slave, the vestiplicus, whose sole job every morning was to meticulously arrange the heavy folds of wool around their master's body to achieve the perfect, legally mandated drape. But the toga was also an exclusive, fiercely protected club. It was illegal for non-citizens, foreigners, and slaves to wear it. If a banished Roman citizen was caught wearing a toga, they could be severely punished. Conversely, female prostitutes were completely banned from wearing the traditional, respectable clothing of Roman matrons, known as the stola. Instead, in a brutal act of public humiliation, they were legally forced to wear a plain, rough toga, visually branding them as social outcasts on the bustling streets of Rome. However, the shape of the clothing was only half the battle. The true battleground of ancient high fashion was color. In our modern world of synthetic chemical dyes, we can walk into a store and buy a vibrant neon green or electric blue shirt for a few dollars. In the ancient world, brilliant, permanent, color-fast dye was rarer than gold. And the undisputed emperor of all colors, the most coveted, violently protected, and astronomically expensive pigment in the entire history of human civilization, was Tyrian purple. To understand the madness of Tyrian purple, we have to look to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, specifically to the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, in modern-day Lebanon. The Phoenicians discovered that a specific family of predatory sea snails, the murex snails, possessed a tiny gland that produced a drop of yellowish fluid. When this fluid was exposed to sunlight and air, a magical chemical reaction occurred. It slowly shifted from yellow to green to blue and finally settled into a rich, vibrant, impossibly deep, blood-red purple that would never fade even when washed. In fact, Tyrian purple actually grew brighter and more intense the longer it was exposed to the harsh sun. But harvesting this dye was a massive, horrific industrial undertaking. You needed to crack open the shells of roughly 10,000 individual murex snails, carefully extract the tiny gland by hand, and boil it in massive vats of salt water and stale urine for over 10 days. The stench of the boiling snail glands and urine was so absolutely putrid, so overwhelmingly foul, that the dye factories had to be placed miles downwind of the city limits to prevent the citizens of Tyre from constantly vomiting in the streets. The astronomical labor required to produce this dye made it terrifyingly expensive. By the time of the Roman Empire, a single pound of high-quality double-dyed Tyrian purple silk cost roughly 3 times its weight in solid gold. It was a price tag so high that it literally boggles the modern mind. Because of this staggering cost, Tyrian purple became the ultimate, indisputable symbol of absolute godlike power. The famous Egyptian queen Cleopatra was entirely obsessed with it. She allegedly even dyed the massive sails of her royal barge Tyrian purple, so the Roman general Mark Antony could see her wealth approaching from miles away across the Mediterranean. When the Roman emperors consolidated power, they decided that mere wealth was no longer enough. They enacted draconian sumptuary laws, completely monopolizing the color. By the reign of Emperor Nero, if you were a private citizen and you were caught wearing or even purchasing a garment dyed with true Tyrian purple, the punishment was the immediate confiscation of all your property, followed by a swift execution. The color literally belonged to the emperor. The secret of the East. While the Romans were obsessing over heavy wool and rotting sea snails, an entirely different kind of fashion revolution was unfolding thousands of miles away in the East. The Chinese had discovered a fiber so lightweight, so strong, and so unbelievably soft that when it eventually made its way to Europe, it completely shattered the global economy. They had discovered silk. According to ancient Chinese mythology, the discovery of silk happened around 2700 BCE, when the Empress Leizu was drinking a hot cup of tea under a mulberry tree. A small white cocoon fell from the branches directly into her steaming cup. As she tried to fish it out, the hot water dissolved the protective glue holding the cocoon together, and the Empress found herself pulling a shimmering, nearly invisible, impossibly long thread. Whether the myth is true or not, the biological reality of silk is absolutely staggering. It is produced by the Bombyx mori, a highly specialized domesticated moth. When the caterpillar is preparing to transform, it extrudes a continuous liquid protein from its salivary glands, which instantly hardens into a solid, triangular-shaped fiber upon hitting the air. The caterpillar spins this single, unbroken thread in a figure-8 pattern around its body for days, creating a protective cocoon. A single cocoon can contain a continuous thread of silk that is up to 3,000 feet long. To harvest the silk without breaking that precious continuous thread, the ancient Chinese developed a brutal, highly efficient process. They could not let the moth hatch because the hatching moth would chew a hole through the cocoon, destroying the long thread and leaving only short, useless fragments. So, just days before the moth was due to emerge, the intact cocoons were plunged into vats of boiling water. This killed the pupa inside and melted the sticky Saracen glue holding the thread together. Workers would then find the microscopic end of the thread, combine it with the threads of several other cocoons, and carefully reel it onto a spool. The resulting fabric was a miracle. Because the silk fiber is triangular, it acts like a microscopic prism, refracting light and giving the fabric its famous shimmering luster. It was highly breathable, incredibly warm for its weight, and it absorbed colorful dyes far better than plant fibers like linen. The Chinese emperors immediately recognized that they possessed a global monopoly on the greatest textile the world had ever seen. They fiercely guarded the secret of sericulture, silk production. Exporting the fabric was highly encouraged, but attempting to smuggle the silkworm eggs or the mulberry seeds out of China was an act of high treason, punishable by agonizing torture and death. For thousands of years, the secret remained perfectly contained. When this shimmering, near-transparent fabric finally began flowing along the perilous trade routes of the Silk Road and arrived in the bustling markets of Rome, it caused absolute mass hysteria. The wealthy Roman elite, accustomed to the stifling weight of their massive woolen togas, went completely mad for this exotic, lightweight, floating fabric. They bought it in such massive, terrifying quantities that conservative Roman philosophers like Pliny the Elder and Seneca suffered public meltdowns. They wrote scathing treatises condemning silk, claiming that it was draining the Roman economy of all its gold and sending it to mysterious, unknown empires in the East. Furthermore, they found the sheer, clinging nature of the fabric deeply scandalous, complaining that Roman women, and soon effeminate Roman men, were parading around the streets completely visible through the imported Eastern cloth. Despite the moral outrage, the demand for silk only skyrocketed, creating a massive, continuous hemorrhage of Roman wealth. It wasn't until the 6th century CE, during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, that the greatest act of industrial espionage in ancient history finally broke the Chinese monopoly. According to the historian Procopius, Justinian bribed 2 Persian monks who had lived in China. The monks hollowed out their bamboo walking canes, packed them full of incredibly fragile silkworm eggs, and walked thousands of miles back to Constantinople, effectively smuggling the world's most valuable secret right past the border guards. Those few stolen eggs became the foundation of the massive European silk industry that would dominate the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The unbroken thread. When we look back across the vast, sweeping timeline of human history, the story of what we wear is truly the story of who we are. We started as overheating apes, shedding our fur to survive the brutal persistence hunts of the African savanna. We faced the terrifying icy maw of the deep Pleistocene and responded by stealing the skin of our predators, inventing the revolutionary bone needle and sewing our way to the top of the global food chain. We realized that our heavy leather survival suits could be canvases for our vanity, spending 10,000 hours carving mammoth ivory beads just to scream our social status to the freezing winds of Sungir. We settled down, tamed the violent wild sheep into fluffy wool factories, and built the digital binary rhythm of the loom. We crushed thousands of rotting snails to hoard a single bloody shade of purple, and we smuggled worms in bamboo canes to steal the shimmering light of the east. Every single time you get dressed in the morning, you are participating in a multi-million-year-old tradition of defiance. You are choosing an artificial skin. You are navigating the complex, unspoken social codes of your modern tribe, broadcasting your wealth, your profession, your aesthetic taste, and your personality, all before you even open your mouth to speak. The materials have changed. The bone needles have been replaced by robotic, laser-guided sewing machines. The heavy, brain-tanned mammoth hides have been traded for moisture-wicking synthetic polymers and cheap, mass-produced cotton. But the underlying, deeply human impulse remains exactly the same. We wear clothes to protect our fragile, sweating bodies from a universe that wants to kill us. And we wear clothes to show the universe exactly who is in charge. So the next time you stand in front of your open closet, annoyed that you have nothing to wear, take a moment to look at the woven threads, the bright synthetic dyes, and the meticulously stitched seams. You are looking at the culmination of the greatest survival strategy, the most brilliant technological leap, and the most enduring artistic expression in the history of planet Earth. You are looking at the armor of humanity.